welcome to China's Living Legends.
欢迎来到我的频道。
Where we unpack the fascinating currents of history to unearth insights that still resonate today. You know, when we look back at ancient China, with all its emperors and dynasties, it's natural to wonder, if you plucked an ancient official out of their era, what modern role would they actually play?
Right, like was a chancellor basically a prime minister or a general like a secretary of defense?
Exactly. It sounds simple, but the answer is, well, surprisingly complex.
It really is, because traditional China was fundamentally an official-centric society. Your entire life, your place in the world, was often dictated by where you stood in that vast official hierarchy.
So understanding their system isn't just, about dusting off old history books.
Not at all. It offers incredible insight into power structures, some of which still echo today. And what's particularly fascinating, maybe even a bit puzzling, is the dynamic between the civil officials and the military generals.
That relationship, yeah.
This separation of civil and military became a foundational concept for, 2 millennia of Chinese bureaucracy. To a point, even modern scholars like Francis Fukuyama acknowledge China essentially inventing the civil service system as we might recognize it.
So we're talking about a system where, over time, the civil side consistently seemed to gain the upper hand over the military, which feels counterintuitive, doesn't it?
It really does.
How did these seemingly pure talk scholars sometimes manage to wield more real power than decorated warriors, especially in periods like the Wei and Jin dynasties, where it looked like philosophical debates mattered more than battlefield wins?
That's the core mystery, and it's really where we should start our deep dive today, because the general trend was the ascendancy of civil officials.
Okay, let's unpack this evolution, because it definitely wasn't always like that, was it?
No. If you rewind way back to the Western Zoo in the spring and autumn periods, there really wasn't a clear line between civil and military duties.
Right. The aristocrats back then were expected to be, well, good at everything.
Exactly. All-round talents. They'd lead troops into battle, then head back to court to advise on state matters. An all-in-one kind of deal.
But something changed. That model couldn't last.
Couldn't keep up. Not with the new realities of war that emerged. The Warring States period. I mean, the name itself tells you something. It just blew up the scale of conflict entirely.
And there's that famous dialogue, isn't there, from the strategies of the Warring States?
Yes. With Tian Dan, the famous Qi general who'd actually become a chancellor over in Zhao. He's trying to sound all wise, talking to the local Zhao generals, Zhao Shi.
And Tian Dan says something like, "General, you're always calling up hundreds of thousands of men. It's exhausting the nation. The sage kings of old only needed 30,000 troops." Something like that.
Pretty much, he thought that was a more, reasonable number.
And Zhao Shi's reply was just devastatingly blunt.
Absolutely. He basically said, you not only don't understand warfare, but you also completely misunderstand the era we live in. Ouch.
Wow. Laying it out there.
And he was right. What had changed? Well, first, the sheer number of people involved in wars exploded. We're talking hundreds of thousands. At the Battle of Changping, maybe 1 million soldiers combined.
1 million. That's staggering.
And second, the wars dragged on. Changping lasted for 3 years.
3 years?
So Zhao, Xi's point was simple. Look, with just 30,000 men, you couldn't even surround one corner of a big city wall, let alone fight a proper field battle. What were you going to achieve?
And the logistics. I mean, just feeding that many people.
Right. Never mind the weapons, the supplies, and the transport losses were insane. Maybe 90% grain loss just getting it there.
90%. Just thinking about shipping groceries across town is a headache, let alone feeding an army under those conditions. The scale of that logistical nightmare is almost unimaginable.
It really tested a nation's deep capacity for social mobilization, as scholars put it. Getting everyone organized, moving resources. It was immense.
So a general on the front line, trying to figure out battle strategy,
Was already mentally maxed out. There was just no way they could also manage this incredibly daunting logistical problem from afar.
which led to, what, a formal split?
Pretty much. A crucial institutional shift started to happen. The formal separation of civil and military paths. From the Warring States period onwards, being a civil official and being a military general became increasingly distinct professions.
So this wasn't some abstract philosophical debate. It was purely practical. driven by the sheer scale of the challenge.
Exactly, like a system upgrade forced by skyrocketing complexity.
That makes so much sense.
Yeah, from an organizational theory perspective, it's almost a necessary law of professional specialization. Think about a modern startup, right?
Okay.
Initially, the founder does everything sales, finance, the lot. But once they scale up, they have to create separate departments, marketing, finance, operations.
Because one person can't handle it all effectively anymore.
Precisely. The system scale determines organizational form. Generals became the front-end execution when the battle. But the civil officials, they became the back-end support, make sure the battle can be fought, and fought sustainably.
They're totally interdependent then.
Completely. And this transformation, it really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What does this tell you about how organizations, even today, grow and have to adapt?
That really reframes how you think about power. It wasn't just about who is the biggest hero on the field,
Right.
but about who is mastering this increasingly complex, absolutely vital support system behind the scenes. But even with that separation, I still imagine that generals seemed more, I don't know, dazzling, especially during the warring states. They were the visible heroes, surely.
For a time, yes, they probably still captured the imagination more. But then came the Qin unification, and after that, the absolutely brutal Chuhan contention.
That war was devastating, wasn't it? The population just plummeted.
It was beyond anything seen before. And when even the most brilliant military geniuses couldn't land a decisive knockout blow on the battlefield, the war just grooved. It evolved. It became a raw competition of logistics.
Pure endurance. And this
Yes.
is where someone like Shao, he steps into the limelight, right?
Exactly. Liu Bang, the guy who founded the Han Dynasty, ranked Shao first among all his meritorious subjects.
Not a general, but the logistics guy.
Precisely. Not for battlefield glory, but because Shao, he was the one who made sure that no matter how badly Liu Bang got beaten up at the front lines, and he did get beaten up, he always had food for his troops and fresh soldiers to replenish the ranks.
That speaks volumes about where the real sustainable power had shifted.
It absolutely does.
Yeah.
And this structural power shift, it only got stronger during the Han Dynasty, especially with their long border wars against the Xianyu nomads.
And there's that story about Emperor Wen.
Yes, from the records of the Grand Historian, Emperor Wen is hearing about the legendary warring states generals like Lian Po and Li Mu, and he sighs, oh, if only I had generals like them, why would I worry about the Xiongnu? Sounds reasonable enough. But then Feng Tang, one of his court ministers, just drops a truth bomb. He says, Your Majesty, even if you had Lian Po and Li Mu, you probably wouldn't be able to use them effectively.
Oof. Imagine saying that to the emperor. The tension in that room.
Right. Emperor Wen, probably a bit taken aback, asks him why. And Feng Tang explains that back in Li Mu's day, military affairs were basically left entirely to the general. That old principle. A general abroad is not bound by the orders of his sovereign.
Okay, total autonomy on the ground.
But by Emperor Wen's time, the imperial method was, as Feng Tang put it, laws too detailed, rewards too light, and punishments too severe.
Micromanagement from the capital.
And court officials were constantly evaluating the generals, very strictly. Feng Tang even gives an example. A general got stripped of his title and thrown in prison for a year, just because he misreported the number of enemy heads taken by 6.
6 heads. That's incredibly harsh. It sounds maddening, like being constantly second-guessed. So deep distrust was one major issue.
That was a huge problem. And the second, maybe even more crippling issue for the generals was resources.
The logistics again?
Always the logistics. Border warfare depended entirely on supplies coming from the Great Rear, from the heartland controlled by the civil administration.
So if a general on the frontier didn't have a good relationship with the folks back in court?
The rear could easily throw up roadblocks. A simple bureaucratic phrase like, oh, we're processing this matter through the proper channels, could literally mean soldiers starving hundreds of miles away.
And what could the general do? Short of outright rebellion, which is obviously a huge step.
Almost nothing. It was an incredibly difficult position. It wasn't just about harsh rules. It was this subtle structural domination. The civil officials basically held the keys to the supply closet.
They held the resource switch, as you put it.
That's the core of it. Control over the resource chain ultimately determines who has the right to speak, who has the real power. No matter how brave or brilliant a general was, they had to constantly worry about keeping logistics happy.
It's like that modern corporate parallel you mentioned.
Exactly. Your sales teams, they're the generals out there winning deals. But they are completely dependent on the finance department, the civil officials approving budgets, or the supply chain delivering the product.
If finance has no budget or the supply chain gets cut.
Doesn't matter how good your sales team is, their performance hits zero.
Yeah.
Same fundamental dynamic.
I can really see that now. And it makes sense why the civil side gains so much power. The general's achievements, heads taken, cities captured, they're so visible, so tangible.
Right, very concrete results.
But the civil official's contribution managing grain spoilage, ensuring recruitment quotas are met, it's often intangible, isn't it?
Much harder to quantify. And here's the thing. Intangible work is often much easier to frame or maybe disguise as procedural compliance.
Ah, the power of procedure.
It's like in any large organization today, right?
Yeah.
The hard performance metrics of the business units are always constrained by the rules and procedures set by functional departments like finance, legal, HR.
Tangible results versus intangible control.
And here's the really wild paradox. This whole civil official system was originally created to serve military needs to support the general.
Right, to solve that logistics nightmare.
But it developed such powerful administrative control over society that it ended up using that very control to suppress the military's influence and right to speak.
That is a fascinating, almost ironic twist. And it feels quite different from how things played out in other ancient empires, doesn't it? Like Rome.
Definitely. You think of Rome, you think of the power of the legions, right?
Yeah.
The generals were often the superstars. Their civil service, while functional, just didn't seem to have the same kind of overarching importance or control.
So what was the key difference there? Why did China go down this path?
Geography and infrastructure, fundamentally. China was this vast continental empire.
Land-based.
Exactly. And the cost of land transportation back then was astronomical. We mentioned the grain loss, maybe over 90% on really tough expeditions.
Yeah.
Moving stuff overland was incredibly difficult and expensive.
Which meant you needed
A massive, highly organized state administrative apparatus, a powerful civil service, just to manage the logistics. It's why you see those historical phrases pairing the suffering of soldiers with the exhaustion of the people doing the transporting. Without that strong civil system, the logistics were basically impossible.
But Rome had the Mediterranean Sea.
The Great Connector. Rome was largely a circum-Mediterranean empire. Sea transport was vastly cheaper and more efficient. You could move grain, troops, supplies with minimal losses compared to overland routes.
So they didn't need the same level of centralized bureaucratic control for logistics.
Not to the same extent. They could even outsource a lot of the logistical work more easily.
Oh.
And this fundamental difference in infrastructure, it really shaped their long-term historical paths in profound ways.
It reminds me of that historical theory, the Paren thesis.
Right. Paren argued that the rise of the Arab Empire effectively cut off Mediterranean trade, forcing Europeans inland. They then had to try and build large continental empires like Charlemagne's.
But they lacked China's long tradition of a professional civil service.
Exactly. So those attempts were often impressive, but ultimately less stable, harder to sustain over the long haul compared to the recurring unity we see in China. Infrastructure shapes organizational form. It's a key takeaway.
It even applies today, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Think about the internet age. Communication tools like WeChat, Slack, Zoom, they drastically reduced the cost of communication and coordination.
Leading to flatter organizations, remote work.
Right. But traditional industries, maybe manufacturing or resource extraction with complex physical remote logistics, they often still need those multi-level management structures, more akin in principle to ancient China's civil service.
And yet, China's system had this incredible resilience, this self-repairing quality. Dynasties fell, chaos ensued, but the bureaucratic structure tended to reemerge, and unity was usually restored. How?
It functioned a bit like a distributed network. Even if parts of the empire were in turmoil, the underlying system, especially the mechanism for recruiting talent, remained potent.
The Imperial examination system.
Yes. That open process for recruiting officials, theoretically based on merit, constantly allowed the system to absorb elites from across society, replenish its nodes, and maintain its operational logic, even after major disruptions.
It's like an organization that can regenerate its own blood, not just be strong in the moment. It has that built-in talent pipeline for the future.
Precisely. That's the key to long-term organizational survival and strength.
Okay, so we've traced how the civil-military split happened, driven by scale and logistics, and how that led to the civil side gaining this structural upper hand. But what about the power games within the civil service itself? All those shifting titles, the rise and fall of positions like the Chancellor. Were there deeper patterns at play?
Oh, absolutely. Beneath all the changing names and specific duties, there's this eternal cycle, you could say, revolving around power, distance, and trust. It boils down to three, actually very simple, basic rules.
Okay, lay them on us.
Rule 1. Two important figures should keep their distance from each other. Rule 2. A minor figure who is physically close to a major figure can easily become a major figure themselves.
Proximity is power.
Exactly. And Rule 3, once a minor figure becomes a major figure, well, you go back to Rule 1, they need to keep their distance now too.
Huh. It sounds like you're describing office politics in any large company today. The turnover in the executive suite.
It really is timeless. Think about it. Rule 1, keeping important figures apart. In the Qing Dynasty, you had the Viceroy of Lianjiang, based in Nanjing, and the governor of Jiangsu province, based in Suzhou, different cities.
And their relationship was generally okay?
Generally quite stable. But then look at Guangdong province. Both the Viceroy of Liangguang and the governor of Guangdong were stationed in the same city, Guangzhou.
And their relationship.
Famously terrible. Constant friction. So apply that logic to the very top. The emperor and his chancellor, the two most powerful figures. There's always this underlying tension about maintaining the right kind of distance.
Okay, that makes sense for Rule 1. What about Rule 2, the minor figure rising due to proximity? How does that connect to the chancellor?
We have to look at the origin of the word zai, which is the root of zaishan, the common term for chancellor.
What did zai originally mean?
Literally, it meant something like a criminal forced to work inside his master's house. A personal slave, basically. Very low status.
Wow, that's humble beginnings for such a high office.
But over time, the status of the zai rose. They became the household manager. There's even a joke attributed to Confucius saying something like, "If you become wealthy, I'll gladly be your household manager."
So from slave to household manager.
And as monarchical power grew, the ruler's personal zai became the taizai, or grand steward. His chief assistant was the xiangbang, state chancellor. Eventually, those terms merged into the honorific zaixiang.
But the formal title, especially in the Qin and early Han dynasties, was Chengsheng, wasn't it?
Yes, Chengsheng. Think of them as the crucial bridge connecting the emperor to the vast officialdom.
And in the early Han dynasty, especially right after the founding, when the emperor's personal power might have been a bit weaker?
The Chengsheng position reached its peak. They often represented that powerful group who had gained merit through military campaigns during the founding wars.
So what were their core powers then? What made them so influential?
Well, one historian summed it up neatly. They could participate in decision-making and supervise all officials.
Wait, participate in decisions and supervise everyone? That sounds an awful lot like the emperor's own job description.
Doesn't it just? And you can imagine that an ambitious, energetic emperor wouldn't be too thrilled about that kind of power overlap right next door.
No kidding. So someone like Emperor Wu of Han, known for consolidating power.
Exactly. He started appointing chancellors who were more, shall we say, obedient. But fundamentally, he distrusted the position itself because it held too much inherent power, which brings us right back to Rule 3.
The Chengxiang was now clearly a major figure.
A very major figure.
Yeah.
And so the distance problem kicked in again, according to our rules.
And in this case, it wasn't just abstract political distance, but actual physical distance, too.
Yes. The emperor resided deep within the Weiyang Palace complex. The chancellor's main office, the chancellery, was located outside the palace's east gate.
And Weiyang Palace was enormous, you said.
Huge. About 5 million square meters. That's like 7 times the size of the Forbidden City in Beijing. Just sending a messenger back and forth between the emperor's inner sanctum and the chancellor's office could easily take over 2 hours for a round trip.
Wow, that's a significant communication delay built right into the geography.
It really was. And that physical barrier meant the emperor naturally started bypassing the formal chancellor for many day-to-day or urgent matters. He began dealing more directly with the people immediately around him inside the palace.
The minor figures close to the major figure. Rule 2 in action.
Precisely. These were the emperor's close retainers, and they became the new centers of informal but very real power.
So who were these people? What kinds of roles did they have initially?
Well, there were a few key types. You had the Shangshu, who started as fairly lowly palace secretaries, but crucially, they handled all the incoming and outgoing documents.
Controlling the information flow.
Exactly. So the head of the Shangshu office, the Lu Shangshu Shi, often ended up wielding more practical power than the formal chancellor, especially after Emperor Wu's reforms.
Okay, who else?
Then you had the Zongshu, or central secretaries. These were often eunuchs, initially brought in because they could handle confidential secretarial work within the inner palace without, posing a threat. The historian Sima Qin served in this kind of role after his castration. Later emperors like Cao Cao and Cao Pai really relied on them.
So extreme proximity and perceived loyalty. And the third group.
The Shizong. This title originally meant something incredibly humble, like the attendant who held the emperor's urinal, the zihuzi,
Seriously, from urinal holder to...
to a high-ranking title, because that person had incredibly intimate, constant access. Later, Shizong became an additional title granted to high officials, signifying they had the right to enter the palace freely and advise the emperor directly.
So the Shangshu controlling documents, the Zongshu handling secrets, the Shizong offering close counsel. What's the common thread?
Lowly position, great power. That's the key characteristic. Emperors liked using these figures. Why? They were physically nearby, easy to talk to. Their power derived directly from the emperor's personal trust, not from the formal bureaucratic system, so they tended to be more obedient.
And maybe crucially, they were easy scapegoats if things went wrong.
Precisely. Much easier to dismiss a personal secretary than a formally appointed chancellor with deep roots in the bureaucracy.
But these minor officials, the secretaries and attendants, they didn't want to stay minor and reliant on just personal favor forever, did they?
Of course not. Human nature, right?
Yeah.
They craved the security and prestige of institutionalized power. They wanted their informal influence turned into formal positions.
And did they get it? How did that happen?
It happened because, well, not all emperors were like the hyper-diligent Emperor Wu. You'd get emperors who were young or maybe weak or just plain lazy.
And when the emperor wasn't fully engaged...
Power naturally flowed to those closest retainers, who were actually running things day to day within the palace. What started as informal power gradually became standard practice and unwritten rule, and eventually this system caught up and formalized it.
This is how those originally minor Han Dynasty palace offices,
The Shangshu, Zongshu, and Shizong offices.
they evolved over centuries into the great central departments of state in the Sui and Tang dynasties. The Shangshu Sheng, the Zongshu Sheng, Mengxia Sheng.
Exactly. The heads of these departments effectively became the new chancellors, the formal high officials at the apex of the bureaucracy.
Wow, so it's a classic path. First, you gain the real implicit power through personal trust and proximity.
And then, through long-term practice, especially during periods of weaker imperial oversight, you manage to transform that into explicit, systemic, formalized power.
It's just like you see in companies today, isn't it? The special assistant to the CEO, who initially just has the boss's ear.
Suddenly gets promoted to vice president or chief of staff.
Yeah.
It's that classic transition from informal authorization based on trust to a formal appointment with defined powers and responsibilities.
But the cycle didn't just stop there, did it? Because once these former minor officials became the new major figures.
Rule 1 kicks in again. A new ambitious emperor comes along, distrusts these powerful, formalized officials, feels they're too distant or too independent.
And starts cultivating a new group of informal, close retainers to bypass them.
Precisely. It's a recurring pattern throughout Chinese imperial history. You could argue the Grand Council that Yunjichu established in the Qing Dynasty was sort of the ultimate expression of this.
Why the ultimate?
Its offices were located just inside the main palace gate, literally steps away from the emperor's own quarters. It was designed as an absolutely personal, tightly controlled advisory and administrative body, bypassing almost all the formal bureaucracy. It was the emperor trying to achieve maximum proximity and control.
So, did it finally solve the problem? Did the Grand Council break the cycle? Or would it likely have continued if the Qing Dynasty hadn't ended with the Xinhai Revolution?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? While the Grand Council represented the peak of centralized imperial control, it also highlighted the inherent danger of that kind of hyper-centralized model.
How so?
Think of it like a modern founder trying to directly manage all the core departments of a large company themselves.
Skipping the whole executive layer.
Right. It might seem super efficient in the short term, especially if the founder is brilliant. But the entire organization's success becomes completely dependent on the personal ability and energy of that single core decision maker.
So if the emperor is wise and diligent, it works okay.
But if the emperor is incompetent, lazy, or makes bad calls, the whole system can quickly falter or even collapse because there are fewer institutional checks and balances.
That's the ultimate dilemma then. The whole point of institutionalizing the civil service system, creating rules and procedures,
was partly to avoid the pitfalls of arbitrary rule by man, to create stability beyond the character of any single ruler. But the emperor's own drive for absolute power meant they constantly sought ways to break those institutional constraints, often by using these close retainers meddling in politics.
creating this endless tug-of-war, this cycle of centralization, then maybe decentralization as institutions gain power, then re-centralization when the emperor claws it back.
It's a dynamic balance, or perhaps imbalance, that runs through so much of Imperial Chinese history. And it mirrors challenges we still see in organizations today, doesn't it? That constant tension between centralization for control and efficiency versus decentralization for flexibility and vitality. Too much centralization stifles initiative. Too much decentralization can lead to internal friction and chaos. Finding the right balance is an eternal management challenge.
So, wrapping this all up, what does this deep dive tell us? We've seen how the civil-military divide wasn't just a philosophical choice, but a necessity driven by the sheer scale of warfare and logistics in ancient China.
Yeah, that practical pressure was immense.
And how that led, surprisingly, to the long-term ascendancy of civil officials, masters of the intangible control of resources and procedures.
Holding that crucial resource switch.
And then within the civil system itself, that fascinating, almost predictable cycle of power shifting between formal institutions and informal, trusted aides, all driven by the dynamics of distance and trust between the ruler and the ruled. It really feels like this game of power between the imperial center and the bureaucratic machine is a thread running through the entire history.
It truly is. And what's really striking, I think, is how these patterns refuse to stay confined to ancient history. When you look closely at modern organizations, maybe the subtle power wielded by functional departments through intangible control over budgets or processes.
Or how quickly an informal, trusted aide to a leader can suddenly gain immense influence, sometimes bypassing formal structures.
Exactly. You're seeing echoes, really, of these very same power plays that unfolded in the courts of ancient China centuries ago. So the final thought to leave you with is, how might understanding this historical playbook, these ancient dynamics of power, help you navigate the complexities of your own work environment, or even make sense of larger political or global systems today?
Something definitely worth thinking about.
Where we don't just scratch the surface of complex topics, nope, we unearth those surprising insights that truly make you well-informed. Today, we're taking a journey right into the heart of ancient Chinese imperial power. We're exploring two mysteries that seem separate, but are actually, well, profoundly connected.
That's right. On one hand, you've got the emperor, seemingly absolute authority, right? But how did he actually protect himself from threats inside his own court, no less? And then the other side of the coin, this vast, sprawling empire, how did it even manage to govern itself? From the palace all the way down to the tiniest village. It's really a centuries-long saga, full of adaptation, unintended consequences, and this fascinating cat and mouse game that honestly offers incredible lessons, even for us today.
Yeah, we're going to peel back the layers on the ingenious systems, and sometimes, let's be honest, the shockingly disastrous ones that ancient Chinese emperors designed. All about maintaining control, protecting themselves, managing huge territories. So get ready, because you're about to uncover some profound insights into how power really operates, then and now. Okay, so let's dive into that first core mystery. How did the emperor, sitting right at the very top, actually ensure his personal safety? You'd think, wouldn't you, that being emperor is like the safest job in the world. But history, it paints a very, very different picture.
It's a great question, because what you see historically is this pattern of, let's call it, imperial security anxiety. I mean, think about the vulnerability. All that power concentrated in just one person. So to counter that, they developed what you might call a multi-layered redundant system designed specifically to stop any single point of failure. The Imperial Guard wasn't just an army, it was a whole security mechanism built on this principle: trust no single individual, only the system's own checks and balances.
Wow, okay. Trust the system, not the person. That's fascinating. So what did this super sophisticated system look like? Say, in the Han Dynasty, we're talking about the army basically parked right in the capital city.
Precisely. And it wasn't monolithic. It was several distinct units, each with its role. First, you had the Lang Zongling, the palace gentleman commander, his troops, inside the imperial palace, guarding the inner sanctum, the gates. Then there was the Wai Wei, the guard commander, bigger force stationed outside the palace walls, a different layer. And finally, the Zongwei, the metropolitan commandant. He was responsible for the whole capital city's security, policing, general order. So 3 distinct spheres.
Right. And what's really compelling here, you mentioned the Lang Songling, his position wasn't just military, was it? Because his office was inside the palace, he had this direct, easy access to the emperor, which meant huge influence, right, across the whole government.
Exactly. This is a classic case of informal power shrimping formal titles. Proximity is power. The cost, for the Langzongling to get information or influence to the emperor, incredibly low. And we see this play out disastrously sometimes. Think of Zhao Gao, Langzongling, under the second emperor of Qin. He systematically sidelined Chancellor Li Si, drove him to his death, actually. It's a private secretary or maybe a chief of staff in a modern company, the person with the easiest access. They often wield power way beyond their job description. Sometimes they even control the information flow to the top. It's a chilling thought.
So this palace gentleman system, it wasn't just security guards. It was also like a talent pool, a pipeline. You had these ambitious young guys, sons of officials, rich merchants' kids, talented youths from out in the provinces, all trying to catch the emperor's eye.
Absolutely. Think of it as an internal circulation system for the elite. Now, on the surface, it looked like it offered diverse backgrounds a shot at power. But the core, the real influence and opportunity, it's still mostly circulated within an established network. It's something we still see today, frankly. In elite recruitment, even with outward fairness, there are often these subtle kind of hidden barriers, social capital, connections. They still shape who really gets ahead.
It's so easy to get that survivorship bias looking back, isn't it? We read about the famous ones like Jie Yi or Sima Qian, big names, scholars, historians who started as palace gentlemen and made it big. But what about all the others, the ones who didn't make it?
Exactly right. History, well, it tends to remember the winners, the ones who survived the system. We rarely hear about the probably many more palace gentlemen who never got that imperial favor, whose ambitions just withered away in the palace courts. The system, yeah, it had potential, but it was a massive gamble for a lot of people. A path paved with, I'd imagine, a lot of disappointment alongside the opportunity.
That makes total sense. Okay, but back to those three distinct imperial guard forces in Chang'an, the capital. Why three? It sounds inefficient. Overlapping institutions, potential confusion. Wouldn't one big unified force be simpler?
Well, that seeming inefficiency, that was actually the whole point. It was deliberately sophisticated power redundancy system. Look, the Langzongling's force, elite, yes, but small, stuck inside the palace, the Waiwei. They provided central support, like a general protective layer. And the Zhongwei's force was the biggest, the strongest, but also the hardest to mobilize quickly. Clunky, you might say. So this design meant anyone trying a coup needed to control at least two of these forces to even have a chance. It's like, a big corporate purchase needing sign-offs from finance, legal, and senior management. It prevents one person from going rogue. You sacrifice some speed for maximum stability.
Right. Stability over speed. And we can actually see this system in action at really critical moments in history. After Liu Bang, the founder of the Han Dynasty, died, his widow, the powerful Empress Liu, she cleverly used her nephews, right? Liu and Liu Chan. Put them in charge of the Zhongwei and the Waiwei, lock down her power.
Yes. But what's really fascinating is how that system then got dismantled after she died. The Han officials, they didn't just storm the palace. No. First, they tricked Liu out of his Zhongwei command. Cleverly. Then they subtly planted their own guys in the Waiwei. And that move, it completely neutralized Liu Chen. He couldn't mobilize his troops, led to his quick downfall. It's a profound lesson, isn't it? Real security comes from direct control over the key resources, not just having permission on paper. It's exactly why new CEOs often replace key executives when they take over a company. They need that direct control to actually wield power.
Wow. So understanding this dynamic was literally life or death. Emperor Wen of Han, even before he officially took the throne, he got this complete. His first move, strategically, replace the Langzongling and the Zhongwei. Immediately, with his own trusted guys brought straight from his personal fiefdom.
It's such a crucial detail. It just screams, who controls what matters infinitely more than who says what? Or consider Emperor Wu's grandson, Liu He, deposed after just 27 days by the powerful regent Huang. And notice this, Huang deliberately left the Zhongwei and Langzongling out of his first round of purges. Why? Because he already controlled them. An emperor without the solid backing of the Imperial Guard, basically doomed from the start. That's why when you're reading historical texts, pay attention to the personnel changes, the appointments. That tells you more about the real power shifts than all the flowery diplomatic language. Those appointments, they're like the raw code of the power structure.
But this whole system, as finely tuned as it wasn't static, right? By the late Eastern Han, emperors were trying new things again. Like Emperor Ling setting up his own 8 colonels of the Western Guard, trying to get direct control back over the military.
Exactly. It was an attempt to centralize power even more. But, it inadvertently broke the very checks and balances that had kept the system stable for so long. It created these new independent power bases. And that That led directly to chaos. The rise of powerful warlords, figures like Yuan Shao, Cao Cao, and the guys who dominate the Three Kingdoms period. It actually accelerated the dynasty's fall. Because when the Imperial Guard loses its checks and balances, when it just becomes a tool for factions, it flips from a safeguard to a catalyst for collapse, a really dangerous single point of failure.
And the names themselves changed over time too, right?
Yeah.
Wei and Jin periods, you get positions like Lingjun, Hujun. But that core idea, internal forces, external forces, checking each other, that redundancy that stuck around.
Oh, absolutely. It became a fundamental principle for dynasties that followed, although you also see something interesting, maybe call it positional atrophy. Those once powerful posts, like the original Lang Zongling and Wai Wei, sometimes they became purely ceremonial over time, used to, accommodate senior figures who'd lost their real clout, like getting kicked upstairs to be an honorary director in a modern company. It packages the power shift, makes it look like someone's still important when their actual authority is gone.
Okay, let's talk Tang Dynasty. The Xuanwu Gate incident, that's a classic chilling example of how the guard's layout could literally decide who became emperor. Li Shimin, later Emperor Taizong, he used bribery, alliances to get key commanders on his side, eliminate his brothers, seize the throne.
His success wasn't just brute force, though. It showed a profound, almost surgical understanding of the Imperial Guard's weak points, its keynotes. By seizing Xuanwu Gate, that specific gate, he cut off his rivals completely, controlled the emperor himself. He breached the entire system at one critical point. It just shows even a near-perfect system on paper can fail catastrophically if a single vital link is broken by personal influence and a really calculated strike. It's a masterclass in executing a coup, frankly.
And we also see the guard's role shifting, evolving from just protection to active political intervention. Emperor Xuanzong's special units, the Huangqi and Longwu army, they seemed less about defense, more about direct imperial muscle. And then that infamous mutiny during the Anlushan Rebellion, forcing the emperor to sacrifice his beloved concubine, Yang Guifei. That's the guard acting politically, right?
A hugely perilous evolution, yes. When armies' loyalty, its welfare, gets tied up with specific political factions, they can absolutely turn the tables on their own master. This was the Imperial Guard waking up, you could say, becoming a real political actor. No longer just a shield, but a force that could make or break an emperor's entire reign.
Even fast forward to the Song Dynasty, they had this massive Imperial Guard, like 800,000 troops. But we still see this evolution. Think of Lin Chan from the novel Water Margin. He was a famous instructor in the Guard, skilled, respected. But crucially, he had zero power to actually deploy troops.
Yeah, that was a very deliberate design by the Song emperors. Separate the power of training from the power of command. Smart, right? Prevent any one officer getting too strong. But by the late Northern Song, that system was also decaying, those instructor jobs. They became sinecures, basically well-paid positions with no real duties. It kind of reflected the sad state of many lower-ranking officers in what had become a bloated, increasingly ineffective system.
Okay, and finally, something really unique arrives in the Ming Dynasty. The Jiniwei, the embroidered uniform guard. This was different. A force answering directly to the emperor, with scary powers, surveillance, interrogation.
This was the ultimate bypass, just completely sidestepping all the traditional checks and balances. The Jiniwei created this whole new channel of power, operating entirely outside the normal bureaucracy. It was basically the emperor's private spy agency and secret police rolled into one. A Ming Dynasty version of a shadow cabinet or maybe a security ministry that answers only to the top. And while it definitely boosted the emperor's control in the short run, it also led to this state of, naked, unchecked power, no real oversight on the emperor's own actions. It's a fascinating and, frankly, terrifying institution. Definitely deserves its own deep dive another time.
Okay, so that's one huge dimension of the power struggle.
Yeah.
Just securing the emperor himself. Now, let's pivot. Let's look at that other dynamic, that constant cat-and-mouse game shaping ancient China's whole map. Central court versus local powers.
Right. And the tension here, the fundamental thing to grasp, is that the emperor both totally needed his bureaucracy to rule, but he also deeply fundamentally distrusted it. And this distrust, this maybe paranoia, it drove constant sweeping changes in how the empire was actually divided up and governed on the ground.
It all kicked off with Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor. He slices up his empire into 36 commanderies. Seems beat on paper. The emperor only has to manage, about 40 governors directly? Clean, simple, looks efficient.
Looked perfect for central control, yeah, on paper.
Yeah.
But, like we see in modern organizational design, a system's real results. They're driven by how people in the system behave their incentives, not just what the designer intended. Once you start the game, it takes on a life of its own, really.
And boy, did it spiral in the Han Dynasty. The number of commanderies just exploded, went way over 100. Why? Why so fast?
Well, it was a mix. Some of it was just organic growth, population up, economy getting more complex, needs more administration. But fascinatingly, a big part was simply personnel arrangements, job creation almost. See, as the empire settled into peace, more and more officials qualified or, earned the right to be governors. But there weren't enough existing jobs. So the solution, just create more commanderies. It was a classic case of too many monks, not enough porridge, so they just made more porridge bowls, if you like.
Okay, but that expansion created huge problems for the center, right? It overwhelmed them. Emperor Wu's surprise inspection tour. That story is wild. Governors in Heidong and Longji committing suicide rather than face him. The Baidi governor executed right there.
Yeah, and that wasn't just, poor stress management by those governors. It was a symptom of a real systemic crisis. Call it an organizational size paradox. The central government just lost effective personal oversight. It got too big. Those governors, they had nowhere to run, no appeal process, just self-destruction when faced with this impossible instant accountability from the emperor himself.
But Emperor Wu, he was a problem solver. He came up with a fix, a kind of patch for the system, the inspector system. Divided the empire into 13 big supervisory regions, he called them provinces, and sent out these relatively low-ranking inspectors to keep an eye on the high-ranking governors.
It was pretty ingenious, actually. Think about the dynamic. An inspector, salary maybe 600 units of grain, is now overseeing a governor earning 2,000 units. This system totally leveraged what you might call incentive opportunity cost. Those guys in the lower ranks, way more motivated to find dirt, root out corruption, prove themselves to get promoted. The inspector was basically the emperor's mobile, undercover, disciplinary committee. Imagine the power shift that created overnight.
Clever. But, as we often see, systems don't always stick to the script. These inspectors, they were just meant to be eyes and ears, right? But they started grabbing real power themselves.
Yeah, classic role creep. Happens all the time. When people interact over long periods, roles blur. Governors, under all that pressure, started trying to build relationships with the inspectors, share the blame, cut deals, maybe look the other way sometimes. So the imperial envoy slowly morphed into a regional superior. And eventually, they became these super powerful governor-pastors holding both military and political authority. And it's really no coincidence that many of the warlords who later tore the Han Dynasty apart, Pao Cao, Liu Bei, Yuan Shao, they all held these exact powerful governor-pastor positions.
Wow. So there's the paradox right there. A solution designed to strengthen central control ended up helping to destroy it. The province started as just a virtual zone for inspectors and ended up as a warlord's personal kingdom.
That's what we could call the institutional patch paradox. Flexible fixes seem great short-term, right? Solve the immediate problem. But over time, they can seriously erode the whole system's stability. Too many patches, and the original structure just falls apart, leads to breakdown.
And it seems like history has a short memory, too. Because after all that chaos, 3 kingdoms, Western Jins, you get the Southern and Northern dynasties, and provinces start multiplying like crazy again, often for the same old reasons. Rewarding generals, appeasing powerful rivals.
And then you get that really bizarre phenomenon, the immigrant prefectures and commanderies down in the Southern dynasties. These were administrative units created almost purely for, identity politics. To make northern aristocratic families who'd fled south feel better, they clung to their old regional names, hoping to go back home someday. It was totally ritual politics. Administrative maps used as symbolic gestures, like having a government in exile on paper, more for psychological comfort than actual governing.
What a mess. So, okay, the Sui dynasty finally reunifies China. Emperor Wen steps in. What does he do with this tangle? His solution: radical simplification.
Sure.
Get rid of the commandery level altogether. Just have a clean 2-tiered system. Province, then county. Seems much tidier.
It does seem tidier. But this really highlights the inertia effect in institutional change. Societies often repeat past mistakes, not because they're ignorant necessarily, but because those old patterns, the political pressures, the existing structures, they are incredibly hard to just erase. So the Sui and Tang emperors, despite the reforms, they pretty soon found themselves facing Emperor Wu's exact same old problem, just too many provinces to effectively manage from the center.
Which naturally led them to do Yeah. What any sensible bureaucracy does, create another layer, a
Yeah.
supervisory layer above the provinces. It's almost funny if it wasn't such a big deal.
Exactly. And so you get the circuits in the Tang and Song dynasties, then the moving secretariats under the Yuan, and eventually the provinces, as we basically know them in the Ming and Qing. And their fate, always the same. They consistently evolved from temporary supervisory roles into fixed, incredibly powerful, top-level administrative regions. It's like a fundamental law, maybe the law of institutional immortality. Once a temporary setup gets the power to hand out resources, it will fight to survive, to expand, and eventually to become permanent.
So when you look back over this huge sweep of time, this thousand-year game, it's not just random shuffling, is it? There's a pattern, a rhythm, underlying laws at work.
Absolutely. Three key things stand out. First, every creation starts with an idea, an ideology, like that original commandery county system, born from the core idea of central authority. And all the changes afterwards, however chaotic, they were usually trying to serve that core function, centralize, unify, even if they often fail spectacularly.
Okay, idea first. Second, every reform is driven by reality.
Yeah.
By some pressing need, right?
Precisely. Think about the early Han giving land to non-imperial kings. Not ideal, maybe, but totally necessary to stabilize things after the wars. Or the Yuan dynasty drawing provincial lines right across mountains and rivers. Not convenient for travel, but great for military control, driven by necessity.
Right. And third, every change is gradual. It's a fade-in, not a hard cut.
Yeah, that province evolving from just an inspector zone to a huge power base, that took nearly 300 years. It wasn't overnight. And conversely, systems fade out too. They deteriorate, they get demoted, they transform slowly rather than just disappearing instantly.
So we keep seeing these trends pop up. Top-level regions get downgraded later. Right. Virtual supervisory zones become real administrative units. Temporary fixes become permanent features.
So yeah, if you wanted a really concise summary of like 2,000 years of local administrative change in China, it'd be something like this. Every creation is guided by an ideal. Every reform is forced by the pressures of its time. And every rise and fall is a slow transition, never just an abrupt event.
And this rhythm, this unchanging kind of context underneath all the complex history, that applies way beyond ancient China, surely.
Oh, without a doubt. These core principles, the power of ideals, the relentless push of reality, and the stubborn inertia of systems, they shaped how all large bureaucracies develop. Ancient states, yes, but also modern corporations, huge government agencies, even today's giant internet platforms. You see these same forces at play.
Wow, what an incredible deep dive that was. From those intricate layers of guards protecting one man, the emperor, to the constantly shifting, morphing map of local government. We've really peeled back the curtain on how that struggle for power and control just shaped an entire empire, didn't it, across millennia.
It's such a powerful reminder, I think. Behind every big, grand historical story, there are always these micro-level battles being fought. For resources, for influence, for basic security. And that human element, incentive, ambition, fear, it can often completely reshape even the most perfectly designed systems in ways nobody could have possibly predicted at the start.
So maybe the next time you look at an organizational chart, doesn't matter if it's a government department or a company, don't just see the neat boxes and lines. Ask yourself, okay, what are the informal power structures here? Where's the real flow of resources, the actual points of leverage? And what subtle shifts might be happening, maybe just under the surface, invisible to most people? Because that might just be where you uncover the next big historical aha moment for yourself.
Have you ever stopped and, really thought about how we name historical leaders, especially emperors? Like you hear Emperor Wu of Han or Emperor Taizong of Tang, okay? But then you get Qin Shi Huang, just that. And sometimes they're called Taizu or Gazi. But what is going on with all these different names? It feels like just a trivia thing maybe, but it's actually way deeper. It gets into power, legacy, even how history judges people.
It's a great puzzle to start with because it taps right into something fundamental about ancient China. This idea of the rectification of names, zemming. It sounds kind of abstract, but for them, getting the name right wasn't just politeness. It was about cosmic order, meaning itself.
Wow, okay.
So today, we're going to unpack the two main types of these imperial titles. You got posthumous titles and temple names. And we'll see how their meanings, their original point, and how people actually use them. Well, they change dramatically over time.
So it's a story about language and power.
Exactly. And, spoiler alert, how power often shapes language, not the other way around.
Okay, let's unpack this then. Starting with posthumous titles. Shihao, you called them.
Yep, Shihao. So the key thing here is they were given after death. They were meant to be an evaluation, honest, hopefully, looking at their merits or sometimes their faults.
Ah, so when we hear Emperor Wu of Han, that Wu part meaning marshal, right? That's his posthumous title, like a grade.
Precisely. Or Emperor Wen for Tang Taizong Wen, meaning civil or cultured. It's a judgment call from history. And the tradition supposedly goes way, way back to the Western Zhou dynasty.
Okay, so it's old.
Very old. And think about it, these titles were kind of like ancient China's version of a posthumous brand. If you control the naming, you control the narrative. You shape how history remembers someone forever.
It's a lot of power.
Huge power.
Yeah.
Think about the first Sui kings. King Wen the civil, the accomplished, King Wu the marshal.
Yeah.
Those are glowing reviews, right?
Perfect for founders.
That's a high bar.
Exactly. But then you get the flip side. King Li. His title means the cruel. And history tells us he was a tyrant, sparked a revolt. Or King Yu, the disorderly. He's linked to that story about crying wolf with the beacon fires. His reign ended in collapse. These names were verdicts.
Direct judgments. Wow. And the Confucian ideal behind this was pretty sophisticated, wasn't it?
It really was. The belief was maybe, just maybe, the fear of getting a terrible posthumous name could act as a kind of moral brake on emperors while they were alive.
Like, oh, better not be too tyrannical or I'll be remembered as the cruel forever.
Exactly that. Encourage virtuous rule through the threat of posthumous shame. It's like a post-event disciplinary system trying to influence in-event behavior.
Does that remind you of anything today? Like in business, maybe?
Absolutely. Think about performance reviews or even honorary titles corporations give out. They're meant to motivate, right? Using future recognition, or the lack of it, to shape current actions. But of course, the million-dollar question is, how much did these super powerful rulers really care about their posthumous reputation when faced with tough, maybe self-serving decisions? Did it actually stop them?
Well, there's this amazing story, maybe a bit over the top from the Zhuos one, about King Qing of Chu. His own son forced him to commit suicide. Grim stuff.
Oof, yeah.
So the story goes, after he died, his body refused to close its eyes, just lay there staring at his son.
Seriously, staring from the coffin.
That's the legend. Apparently, the son first picked the title Ling. Now, today, Ling might sound nice, but back then it meant something like disorderly or inept. Ouch.
Not exactly what you want from your dad, even posthumously.
Right, so the corpse keeps staring, eyes wide open. Finally, the son, probably feeling pretty awkward, changes it to Cheng, which means successful or accomplished. And then, supposedly, the eyes closed.
Wow. Okay, maybe slightly embellished, but what's the takeaway there?
It shows that even the most powerful people still operate inside their culture's rules, you know? These titles weren't just labels, they were a part of the symbolic order, maintaining decorum, sending signals, even after death. They mattered.
A powerful signal indeed.
But then, this whole system, this powerful tradition, it hits a brick wall. And this is where it gets really interesting. Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor.
The great disruptor.
Totally. He just abolished the entire posthumous title system. Gone. His reason, pretty blunt. He thought it was an insult. Sons judging fathers, subjects critiquing their ruler. He found it pointless. Offensive, even.
So that's why he's just Qin Shi Huang, first emperor of Qin.
Exactly. It's purely objective. Chronological. No great, no terrible, no judgment at all. Just number one.
And that decision speaks volumes about his whole philosophy, doesn't it? It's pure legalism. Legalism prioritizes effectiveness, obedience, raw power, moral judgments. Confucian hand-wringing, not interested.
So it wasn't about being good or bad, just about being in control.
Pretty much. Subjects obey, they don't evaluate. It was an experiment in, let's call it demoralized governance. A total break from that Confucian idea of moral feedback loops. Raw power, unburdened by what history might say later.
Okay, so Qin Shi Huang gets rid of it, but his dynasty didn't last long. What happened next?
Well, the Han Dynasty comes along, and maybe as a sign of being different, maybe humility, they bring the posthumous title system back.
Ah, okay. Back to normal.
Not quite, because a new trend started. And frankly, it's kind of funny. The titles started getting longer and longer and longer.
How long are we talking?
By the Ming Dynasty, you're seeing posthumous titles that are 17 characters long.
17.
And the king took it even further, sometimes 23 characters. Imagine trying to carve that on a tombstone.
That's ridiculous. What was the point?
Well, think about the dynamic. Courtiers and officials. They didn't dare say anything bad about the emperor who just died, right? Especially not publicly. But flattery. Oh, they were very enthusiastic about flattery.
So it became a competition in praise.
Exactly. It turned into what you could call institutional worship and the involution of praise. a race to outflatter everyone else. What started as an evaluation tool became just a flattery tool.
Like grade inflation, but for emperors?
Perfect analogy.
Right.
It's an inflation in language resources.
Yeah.
When every emperor gets this long string of words, wise, martial, benevolent, sage, filial, brilliant, etc., for 17 or 23 characters.
Which doesn't mean anything anymore.
Precisely.
Yeah.
It's all noise, no signal. You can't tell the truly great ones from the merely okay ones. The evaluation function was totally lost.
So if those long posthumous titles became meaningless, what did people actually call the emperors then?
Ah, good question.
Hmm.
Because people gradually shifted to using a different kind of name more often. They're temple names.
That's where the Zhu and Zong come in, right?
That's them. Temple names or miahong.
Okay, so what's the story with these? Were they also evaluations? Sort of, but different. They were actually a Han Dynasty invention, though they claimed ancient roots. And crucially, unlike posthumous titles, which nobles and officials could also receive, temple names were strictly for emperors.
Exclusively imperial, okay.
And get this, initially, not every emperor even got one. You had to have immense merit. You had to earn your spot, your permanent tablet, in the ancestral temple.
So, higher stakes. What were the criteria?
At first, pretty strict. Zhu, meaning founder, was for emperors with truly massive achievements. Think dynasty founders. Liu Bang, founder of the Han, is called Taizu, or Gozu.
Okay, Zhu for founders. What about Zong?
Zong means ancestor, and it was supposedly for emperors of high virtue.
High virtue. That sounds a bit vague.
Exactly. Compared to founded a dynasty, high virtue is much more subjective, and guess what? In practice, whether an emperor got the Zong title often had less to do with their actual virtue and more to do with the political needs of later emperors.
Ah, politics messing things up again. It's a classic story. Any kind of value judgment, once it gets tangled up in politics, tends to become a tool. It gets instrumentalized. So judging virtue became a way for current rulers to spin the past to make themselves look better, more legitimate. The ancestral temple, in a way, became the ultimate stage for validating power, especially before you had, like, independent academic historians weighing in.
Can you give an example of that? Politics driving the temple name.
Perfect example. Emperor Wu of Han, the same martial emperor we mentioned. Huge reign, big impact. But initially, no temple name.
Really? After all that?
Yep. It was only 15 years after he died that his great-grandson, Emperor Huang, gave him the temple name Shizong.
15 years later, why the delay, and why then?
Politics. Emperor Huang's own path to the throne was complicated. His grandfather had actually been tangled up in a rebellion against Emperor Wu and was deposed, so Xuan's claim was a bit shaky. By giving his great-grandfather, Emperor Wu, this big posthumous honor, elevating him to Shizong.
He was basically boosting his own family's prestige and therefore his own legitimacy.
Exactly. It's a stark reminder, isn't it? History isn't just telling stories. For rulers, it's often about building a legitimacy project, reframing your ancestors to secure your own power.
Did anyone object to giving Emperor Wu that title?
Oh, yeah. Confucian scholars at the time piped up. They said, hang on, Emperor Wu was successful, sure, but he was also overly ambitious, waged too many wars. Standard Confucian critiques.
Yeah.
But their objections, totally overruled. Political needs trumped philosophical consistency.
Okay, so Emperor Xuan opens the door by giving Emperor Wu a temple name for political reasons. What happens next? Does Zong stay prestigious?
Predictably.
Yeah.
No, the devaluation starts pretty quickly. Remember Wang Mang, the regent who eventually took over the Han throne?
Yeah, the usurper.
Well, before he took power, he made this big show of loyalty to the Han emperors.
No.
Oh, he started handing out the Zong title left and right to all the emperors who came after Emperor Sui.
Just giving them away.
It was performative loyalty. Look how much I respect the Han imperial line, even as he was plotting to end it. It's a classic move during power shifts, reshuffle history, praise the path figures to make your own rise seem like a natural, even necessary next step, packaging your succession.
Wow, so the exclusivity was already fading.
Rapidly. Although there was this one interesting little pushback in the later Eastern Han, a famous scholar, Young. After Emperor Ling died, not exactly remembered as a great ruler, Young argued, look, this temple name thing has become meaningless. Let's go back to the strict old rules.
Did they listen?
Surprisingly, yes.
Yeah.
For a short time. They actually revoked several existing temple names that were seen as undeserved. And Emperor Ling himself, he didn't get one. Young succeeded, temporarily.
Just temporarily, though.
Yeah. Sad but common story. Young's effort shows that the original good intentions of a system often can't survive constant abuse. If you don't have strong ways to enforce the rules and correct course, short-term political gain almost always wins out. The system degrades.
So the floodgates opened again after him?
Pretty much. By the Wei and Jin periods, things got even looser. People who weren't even technically emperors, powerful warlords like Cao Cao or the Simas who founded the Jin dynasty, started getting posthumous temple names.
Wait, non-emperors getting temple names?
Yep. The lines blurred completely. By the chaotic northern and southern dynasties period, getting a temple name was almost easy. And by the time the Tang dynasty rolls around, it's just standard procedure. Every emperor gets one. It went from super exclusive honor to just expected.
So both systems basically collapsed under their own weight, or under the weight of politics.
That's a great way to put it. The decay of both posthumous titles and temple names is really about idealism crashing into real politics. Posthumous titles started as evaluations, became empty flattery. Temple names started as exclusive honors, became commonplace participation trophies. When a system gets manipulated, overused, twisted for political gain, it just loses trust. It loses respect. It stops doing what it was meant to do. The language itself gets devalued.
Like that inflation idea again. Too much praise money chasing too few actual achievements.
Yeah.
So wrapping this up, what's the big takeaway for us listening today?
I think this dive into these ancient naming conventions gives us a really timeless lesson. It's about the life cycle of institutions, the push and pull of power. We saw posthumous titles meant for judgment bloat into flattery and lose all focus. And temple names, meant for rare honor, become so common they lost all meaning. It really shows how easily good intentions can get diluted by ambition and, frankly, the desire to just smooth things over politically.
That makes you wonder.
It really should. This whole story provides a lens to look at our own world. Think about it. What systems or labels do we have today? Maybe titles, awards, rankings, certifications that were originally designed for genuine evaluation or real honor. Are any of them going through a similar process? Are they being devalued by empty flattery, by political maneuvering, maybe just by lazy application or lack of enforcement?
Like, are we seeing that inflation of language resources now?
That's the question to ask yourself. Can you spot the habitual abuse of systems in your own work and society and the media you consume before they become meaningless? Think about the awards given out, the job titles people have, the way achievements are described. Are they still conveying real meaning and distinction? Or are they becoming just noise? Another form of empty praise
Useful, maybe learn something new, definitely hit that subscribe button. We do these deep dives regularly, exploring valuable ideas.
We appreciate you tuning in.
Yeah, thanks for joining us.